I just start with the introduction. We will be talking about open access infrastructure, and we have been talking about open access within the industry already for quite a long time. And lately we see that there's lots of examples of actual open access implementations and lots of different models, and also open access flavors, either fully gold or green, platinum, diamond, hybrid. Within this conference, we've already heard some of these examples. And I'm talking today with three panelists, starting with Yvonne Kampfens, who is the, the Executive Director of the Stichting OA Switchboard, which is the latest legal entity which will move the open access switchboard forward. And she started 1 year ago as the project manager for the OA Switchboard. She has been working in publishing for the last 25 years in various roles and for various companies, including Elsevier, Swets, and Springer Nature. So I'm still unable to share my screen, so I continue talking. We also have Martin Jagerhorn joining us, and he's been working as business development advisor and investor in tech companies within the research domain for 20 years or so. And currently he's advising for Chronos Hub. And in this session, he will talk about Chronos Hub and what it could do to help the implementation of open access. So then we have Anne Michael, who we have already seen before today. And thank you very much for your very interesting talk. She's the founder and CEO of DeltaThink. And she herself is specialized in strategy and innovation in scholarly communications. So also noteworthy is that in 2017, the DeltaThink's open access data and analytics tool was launched, which provides visualizations and analysis. And from that background, she would be able to contribute within this session. Good, so let me start by asking a question to Anne. We have heard a lot about various models for open access and also about transformative agreements. Yesterday, for instance, in Tasha's session, it came about, and also about the open access switchboard, which we will turn to later, Yvonne. What would you suggest, Anne, for smaller companies, smaller publishing companies, how they can start? Because also in your presentation today, you said that it's very important that we listen and we learn from what our communities need. And based on the company's data, where would you suggest they start with their analyses?
Well, when they're considering whether or not they, how to introduce an open access option. So it's, unfortunately, I'll go through some of this when we get to my slides. I think the important thing is for them to understand just who they are and what they are, what disciplines they are, how do the researchers in their discipline act, where do they normally publish, do they publish open access or not, which funders do they have, are their funders starting to initiate mandates that will impact them, and then so even what that will do is maybe establish a sense of urgency. But even where there isn't a sense of urgency, they can also be obviously looking at their mission and other things to say whether or not their market and their discipline is moving in a certain direction. Is moving toward an open access option something that's also important to their mission, as a society, as a small society. And then, I think it's going to be interesting to hear from Martin and Yvonne as we go on. And this is kind of the ending of how I end my section. But I do think that, scale is an issue, and these little guys, and I say that with love in my heart because I work with a lot of them, they don't always have IT departments. Some of these organizations might have fewer than 10 people in them. And so looking for solutions in the marketplace, once they come up with a strategy and they understand how they want open access to play within their portfolio or their single journal, because again, sometimes these are extremely small, I think it really does make sense for them to see what's out there in a cost-effective way that can support them. And I mean, obviously, some publishers or some societies are published by commercial publishers and have tools and things available to them. Others are not. Some societies are published with a commercial publisher, but want to start their open access journal in a different way. So the idea of what can help them to manage that workflow, manage that payment process, manage the customer, the user experience is really important. If we don't, let me just see, do we have share yet? We can't.
No.
Astrid, why don't I go through mine without the slides? Because
yeah, sure.
There's one graph, but the rest of them are just visuals anyway. So
yeah,
forgive me by
yeah, otherwise I share them afterwards with all of the participants, if that's okay by you.
Sure. So, you know, so I'd intended to kind of start this by, you know, kicking off the idea of this infrastructure talk, thinking about what's happening in the market and, you know, what is influencing the direction of the market. So as we point out, obviously, one key driver for anyone is where's the market heading? What I would have up right now, if I had up my slides, would be a graph that shows open access on the rise, open access uptake. And what's interesting about this graph is that if you look at it, it doesn't look like there's a whole bunch of change, but the reality is from 2016 to 2019, we went from about 24.7 or 25% gold OA in the market. That means gold and hybrid or gold and fully OA journals to now a little over 32%. And that 32% is about 895,000 articles in 2019. So there's definitely an increase. I think that some, you know, depending on where you sit in the ecosystem, might say it's a slow and steady increase. But I think that the next thing to think about is what's really the direction of travel. So when you look at current publishing trends, when you think about funder mandates, you know, according to the very well-known and popularly understood or discussed Plan S, and then some of the transformative agreements that the Plan S in particular is going to push forward and to, you know, and to value. And then as well as what's happened with COVID and the whole idea that, you know, we had publishers making their COVID research accessible and then, you know, for a time, and then that time wasn't forever. You know, I think that the marketplace, the researchers, institutions involved, especially, you know, academic institutions and others are starting to wonder whether 2020, when we have the data on 2020 and going forward, we're going to see an acceleration in open access. And again, there are lots of data points we could talk about, but at the end of the day, it's conjecture at this point, but it's certainly something that's thought about. So Astrid, at this point.
You can try again if you want. I'm able to share now.
You are able to share. Ah, perfect. Okay. So I was going to say, Astrid, that at this point, let me just get to the full screen option here, is when we were going to see that beautiful bowl of stones that you were asking me about as we prepared. So I think that the one thing to think about is, although many of these stones in this bowl, just like them, are made of similar materials, they're very different. They're all different shapes and sizes, and there are different kinds of organizations that are participating you know, in the publishing ecosystem. So of course we have commercial publishers of varying sizes that serve varying disciplines, that all of those disciplines have varying perceptions of open access as well as other issues within the scholarly ecosystem. There's not-for-profit publishers like PLOS who don't really have a membership aspect to them. There are society publishers, many of them with commercial organizations, many of them not with commercial organizations, and there are even fully open. The reason I bring up PLOS and even Frontiers or MDPI is that you've also got open access organizations that are fully open access that are looking at different business models that aren't necessarily APC based. And all of these changes, all of these considerations require potentially changes to how you work. You know, and in summary, if you think about it, you've got you may be a small publisher or any size publisher that wants to introduce an open access option. You might want to introduce a new open access journal. You might look at flipping an existing hybrid journal. You might be looking at to move towards a non-APC model from a model that currently is an open access model that's supported by APCs. And you might also be thinking about establishing some kind of cascade about how do I get one of my journals, or to benefit from the articles that may be good articles that aren't necessarily suitable for a core journal. And operationally, this introduces some challenges. It's very easy on the business side sometimes to think, oh, this is just a piece of cake, we'll put in a new workflow and that's that. But there are a lot of questions that come up when you think about an author interacting with your organization. Are they covered by a transformative agreement? What does the transformative agreement cover? Are they established to a discount? Are they, entitled to a discount? Are they entitled to waivers? All of these things need to be understood, and you need to capture good data about this so you can continue to serve the market in a way that sustains your organization and obviously pushes your discipline forward. And so what I would say is that there's a surprising amount of complexity here, not only in the interaction with your user, with your author, but also in the data and workflows behind this. And so what I think we're going to hear, and I'm very excited to hear from Ivani and from Martin, are ways in which you can address some of these concerns. Now, again, as the question Astrid asked to begin with, there's a lot involved in determining your strategy, open access, your level of urgency, how it's going to support your author community, how it's going to line up with various funding requirements. And I mean, open access strategy is something you do first. But once you have your strategy and once you understand how that impacts your portfolio and you're implementing that strategy, these kinds of tools are invaluable to your progress. And the question I would ask myself is this something I can do myself? Or even if I could, is this really the best use of my resources when there are solutions in the market that could do this in a cost-effective manner for me? And with that, Astrid, I will stop sharing.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, also with regards to David's talk yesterday about decision, there's so many decisions to make. So we go to Yvonne now. Are you ready to share your screen and start your short presentation?
Yes, Astrid, I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah, awesome. Good, I'll go quickly because I think we only have 5 minutes, right? And you want to allow for some panel discussion as well. Great. And Anne did a great job in introducing, setting the scene and introducing my talk. Open access is indeed growing. Open access output is indeed growing year on year. And there's widespread belief that research will function better if results are made openly available to the community. However, for a breakthrough in the transformation of the market, such that open access is supported as the predominant model of publication, a joint challenge has to be addressed. And mentioned it, the complexity around the implementation of multilateral open access publication level arrangements is challenging. My name is Yvonne Kempens. I'm the Executive Director of the newly founded entity that will indeed run the OA Switchboard moving forward. On November 5th, it was announced that OSPA, the Association of OA Publishers, founded this new organization with a future-proof governance and funding structure, a neutral, independent entity where economic interests and control are separated, so we don't have shareholders, and it's collectively controlled by funders, institutions, and publishers, and obviously not for profit. Then, what is the OA Switchboard? It's very simple. If you look at the bottom, I think this is a tech conference, so people will get this simple visual quite easily. It's a message hub. It enables stakeholder 1 to send a message to stakeholder 2, and stakeholder 2 can send a response. It's routed via the OA switchboard using the ROR identifier as the router, and all the messages are validated in terms of the recipients and if they have all the mandatory fields in there. And that is it. It's a message hub. It's not a fancy service. It's not a fancy interface. It's not a workflow tool. And the idea is it interacts with each and every system, totally interoperable with whatever funders, publishers, and institutions are running. So a central information exchange hub connecting parties and systems and streamlining and standardizing, aiming to bring industry standardization to communicate neutral and neutral exchange of publication level information. So again, this is all situational, no huge database with policies, no database of read and publish agreements. It's case by case communication between two stakeholders. Ensuring a financial settlement can be done simply also means we do not get involved in invoicing and collecting of money. The value it brings, transparency. It's a magic word. People use it a lot, but if you learn more about the switchboard, you see that for all parties that involved, this is truly about transparency and savings, efficiency and cost effectiveness, and the ambition for the whole ecosystem to work better for everyone so we can learn, adjust, and progress, and maybe speed up the move to OA a bit. What do others say, and what are other industries doing? In a recent LinkedIn post, Bill Trippy, an industry veteran now with IEEE, said using the SWIFT analogy was a useful way of framing it. And this was following a talk I had with him and his team. And we do that indeed a lot. How we see it is SWIFT, a global financial messaging services, having been around for 40 years, also a collaborative initiative in an industry to develop common language across banks worldwide. Is basically very, very comparable to what we're doing. And Bill O'Ryan, another industry veteran in the same LinkedIn thread, said, OA Switchboard facilitates the interoperability with other systems in the OA workflow to help take the friction out of e-commerce reporting and messaging. Now, so much for setting the scene and hopefully making a bit clearer what we do. This is my last slide. And in the spirit of this conference, I wanted to talk a bit more on how we do that. So the shared infrastructure is crucial, less redundancy, share the cost in a pre-competitive area. As I already mentioned, how other industries have done that for decades. Banking, but also airlines, telecom, and what have you, have all developed essential infrastructures where there's no where competition is not relevant, where they collaborate and save a lot of money in doing it and deliver better services and standards. Open source, also a very explicit choice by design in the whole spirit of the initiative. Open source software promotes collaboration and sharing. And by mechanism, we mean it's a essential mechanism for building transparency and therefore trust. Everybody can see how any algorithms or routing works, and it can really be validated by everybody as a neutral host and facilitator, what we aspire to be. On the cost side, also no vendor lock-in, guaranteed exit scenario, no risk of being locked up with a specific vendor, and the license-free model. It's developed by our tech partner, actually, Elitex in Ukraine, and thereafter it's open source, and there is no licensing model, so no extra cost if we're setting up extra customers. Using the latest underlying technology, cloud first, we're using microservices, platform as a service and database as a service, 100% serverless, and JSON, webhooks, JavaScript, all modern web standards are being used. Now, crucial for this specific application, what we're doing is ensuring scalability, security, privacy, and confidentiality. We do that both by contracts and by technology. And it's crucially important if we're talking pre-publication data. So information about manuscripts that are going through peer review have not yet been published, that patron privacy and any kind of personal privacy is acknowledged and secured. But also, although we are not a database and we don't keep data on read and publish deals and transformative agreements and what have you, there may be commercially sensitive information, pricing information flying around. So we also have to secure that that is all in order. So we have various means of doing that. Maybe I'll save them for the panel discussion if needed, but it's quite crucial that whereas we're working with open source and kind of work with metadata, it doesn't immediately necessarily even mean that everything is available for everybody for free at all. So that concludes my introduction. Astrid, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm curious to hear questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So to all of the attendees, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we move to Martin Jagelhorn. Within his field, he talks to many different stakeholders, to authors and to universities and also to national initiatives. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Hope you can hear me well and also see the screen. I'm on a very shaky mobile phone connection here today, so hopefully the technology will stay with us. So I'll introduce Chronos Hub to you very briefly, but it's truly about streamlining open access management, and we try to take a very collaborative approach, as Astrid mentioned. So it is, just to clarify that as well, so Chronos Hub is the name of the platform streamlining publications and reporting processes, but it's also the name of the company, which is based in Copenhagen. And most people know Chronos Hub through the Gates Foundation. That's how it started back in, it was launched in 2017 in connection with the Bill and Melinda Gates new policy at the time. You'll of course all know that they will have a new policy taking place or taking effect now as well as part of Plan S. But towards the end of last year, we started to expand and open up Chronos Hub. So since then, we have now started to work more closely together with a number of additional funders, institutions, consortia, and also directly with a number of publishers. And you see a few illustrated here. So I thought that as this discussion has already outlined the problem and the situation we have as a starting point around Chronos Hub, I probably don't have to talk too much about this, this situation. We heard Anne previously, and also Astrid and Yvonne. But as you all know, funders have increasing policies, making it quite difficult for researchers to know where they can publish in compliant ways. We have institutions that have a quite time-consuming processes to go into different open access dashboards to figure out where they should pay for any APCs. But primarily, we have a lot of manual work, as we've heard several times already. Researchers, they submit data to publishers, and the same data again on the outputs of the grants back to funders. And they also manually have to populate institutional repositories and other internal systems. So as you all know, the situation today is quite fragmented, seen to the different systems. That's why it's great to see initiatives like the OA Switchboard trying to help amend this communication. And there are obviously others that try to get the communication to flow in a more seamless way. So the approach that we take from a Chronos Hub perspective is really to try to get all the different stakeholders, as you can see here, to communicate more seamlessly together. And I've chosen to take the perspective of publishers here. It's very similar if you look at this slide from a funder's perspective, institution's perspective as well, but there are slight nuances to that. I thought that we could also have a very, very quick look at a more concrete case, how we work together with one publisher, Emerald. I'll walk you through that in an even more technical way, as I understand the audience is quite technically oriented. But so together with Emerald, we work essentially on 4 different areas. One part here is that we provide through Chronos Hub a Emerald branded environment. So researchers can go in to that environment and do compliance checks with different funders so that they can see which of the Emerald journals that offer compliant route. But it also highlights, as we heard before, if there are any institutional agreements in place. So this means that the authors can see if any of these journal titles are part of a read and publish agreement, if there are any APC discounts, or if they come from a country where they have a 50% waiver or 100% waiver. And Chronos Hub also integrates with a number of submission systems. So all authors can then submit to any of these Emerald journals directly through Chronos Hub. And that means that we can automate the process going back here. An important aspect of Chronos Hub is that we try to adhere to the FAIR principles. So that means upon submission, we already have the ROR IDs for all co-author organizations, ORCID IDs for the authors. We have grant IDs for the grants, and we also work with funders now to issue grant DOIs so that we help mend the research ecosystem, also as said through other system integrations. But that means upon acceptance, institutions and funders have access to a dashboard where they can do their approvals. And they can also have accounts to automate the billing and collection process and get faster payments. So if we quickly walk through that workflow seen from an author's perspective, they log in using their usual username and password, integrating with Emerald's login server. They use liblinks in this example. In Chronos Hub, in the Emerald branded version of Chronos Hub, they then do these compliance checks and see any institutional agreements, make the submission into the underlying systems. And Emerald uses ScholarOne for their 360 journals, and they use F1000 for Emerald Open Research. And upon acceptance, we get data back from these systems and trigger an automate notification to the authors, pulling them in to ask for them to sign the license agreement that they can sign online. And we then, as we know, the funder acknowledgements and co-author affiliations and the journal, of course, and all that information, we can dynamically display only the relevant licenses in that context. And once a license agreement is signed, then we put that into the ECMS system at Emerald. And we also trigger this kind of automated check and notification to the funders if there is a funder acknowledgement from a funder that pays APCs. And if that's not the case, we do the same towards institutions that pay APCs. So the purpose here is really to capture all the information that we can as early as possible to automate these processes and minimize the need for authors to do anything. But that is sort of unfortunately still sort of a path that we sometimes have to take, meaning that if there's no funder or institution picking up the bill, then the authors can pay by credit card or wire transfer. And then upon payment, the money is transferred to Emerald, and we sync the invoice and billing details up with the internal CRM system. So hopefully that describes a little bit in a nutshell what Chronos Hub is and how it works primarily then from a publisher perspective. And I'm also looking very much forward to the further questions as part of the panel. Right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Martin. So what I see in your presentation as well is that there are many steps to take. And one thing that seems to keep on popping up is the need for persistent identifiers. Could you say something in your experience, what you have found about that? Because otherwise, if there is no persistent identifier, it needs to be in various different channels, I guess. And perhaps it is also error prone if there is no PID.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's really a prerequisite to use these globally unique identifiers to automate the processes. Without those, we inevitably have to do some kind of manual validation or verification. And working with hundreds of publishers and knowing that there are about 5,000 publishers out there, we don't believe that it will be possible to so easily get all these 5,000 publishers to have their submission systems fair or compliant with the FAIR principles and using all the right identifiers. A lot of these submission systems still have funder acknowledgements in free text fields or not even globally unique identifiers for the co-author organizations. Not many mandate the use of ORCID IDs. So that's why we try to pick that information up upon submission already. So we're less dependent on whatever the underlying systems are. And that means that when the data or when that submitted article is accepted, we don't need that much information back because we already have all these structural elements and the unique identifiers to then populate other systems, automate reporting back to funders. And we can directly do, as we do with University of Copenhagen, for example, working on automatically pushing the data into their pure CRIS system, which otherwise would, as I said, require manual work. So I think it's really crucial, and it's great to hear that the OA Switchboard uses ROR IDs, for example, and in this context, as I just mentioned, it's also great to see that there are more and more funders that now start to look at issuing grant DOIs. So in our collaboration with funders right now, we only have their internal IDs and so grant IDs, but they are obviously not very useful in a global context. So now we'll start to issue those grant UIs to, as said, yeah, be able to reuse them in other databases like Dimensions and others that use you know, the connection points between the grants and the outputs in various ways.
Okay, so we have seen in your slides and also in Yvonne's, and I think Anne mentioned it before, that there's a very large need for collaboration. And I don't know exactly how to phrase this question, but it goes back to what I asked you at the beginning of this section. Since there are so many complexities, what do you think that publishers should consider while thinking about a possible collaboration with either Chronos, or going to use the OA Switchboard, or perhaps use a different open access platform? We also saw that now the European Commission will start with the open access platform. So it is to be seen what will happen with that. So do you have any comments on that, Anne?
So actually, Astrid, before that, I was just curious for Martin and Ivani. So is the difference, or the primary difference between OA Switchboard and Chronos, is that OA Switchboard is facilitating messages while Chronos is facilitating workflow?
Maybe Yvonne, you would like to comment on that?
Yeah, let me only say what we're doing, which is indeed facilitating messages in a trusted, neutral way. And maybe I can also respond to the last point that Martin made. Of course, I could not agree more, the need for persistent identifiers, but I think we all need to be aware that I think all of us know that so much can change and does change between submission and publication. So the real version of record data come from version of records upon publication. And I think what is really important is not to assume, we're running into that as well with the OA Switchboard, assuming that a journal policy, for instance, is to have a CC BY license, where it might very well be that on an individual article level, it will be decided differently. So, and that does tie into your question. Yes, what we're doing is take at whatever point in time the information available, the data fields, and we use as much as possible, indeed, industry identifiers, and that is being communicated and exchanged and verified through the Communication Hub. And we're not a workflow tool and nothing else. No, thank you.
Should I maybe comment from my point?
Yeah.
As well? So just because we get this question quite often. So what is the relationship really, or how does Chronos Hub and the OA Switchboard relate to each other? And from our point of view, the OA Switchboard is a great possibility for us to integrate with, to facilitate or let us maintain less integrations, essentially. It's like with any hub. You know, the OA Switchboard is a hub, Chronos Hub is a hub. And by connecting two hubs, well, then we enable all funders, institutions, and publishers that work with Chronos Hub to communicate with all institutions, funders, and publishers working with the OA Switchboard. So we can facilitate the communication between them. But then there are other differences. So, I mean, Chronos Hub has this kind of journal finder. We store a lot of the data on all the institutional agreements. It's a service that is used directly by the researchers, which are not really what the OA Switchboard, Yvonne will, of course, interject here if needed. But, these are examples of other differences. But there is a lot of commonalities and a lot of complementarity, because we can facilitate for more stakeholders to communicate with each other in that sense. So we're also looking into starting, hopefully, a pilot soon, where we have some funders, institutions communicating through Chronos Hub and the OA Switchboard.
Astrid, getting back to your question then. So if I'm sitting here and I'm a publisher and I'm thinking about what I'm doing, as I said before, and I won't beat this to death, first I have to have a strategy. I need to understand what OA means to me, and everything drives from that. That's the first thing. But I think the things that I would be thinking about when looking at OA Switchboard and at Chronos Hub would be, first, like I was saying, what am I able to do myself, and what am I not able, or should I not be willing to do myself? So if I already have, this infrastructure, I have a manuscript tracking system, either one of these options is going to require some degree of communication to be established. So I would be looking at, are those connections already made? Like, for example, could I go over to Chronos Hub and they already work with Editorial Manager or Scholar One or whoever it is that I'm using? So I guess, quite frankly, what I'm looking at is a value proposition. What is my level of effort in order to get this done versus how much do I need to pay to do this on a regular basis, to start, and on a regular basis going forward? And, I'm going to be looking at things like, what are the pricing models? Am I paying per transaction? Do I have minimums? Like, how does that work? Because that has to factor into my financial calculations. And depending on my size, that might be an easy no-brainer, or it might be really hard. So, I'd be asking questions like that. And also depending on my size, not only from a revenue perspective, but from a volume perspective. So, if I'm a very, very small publisher and I'm with one journal and it's fewer than, 100 published articles a year, let's say, I might actually first want to understand exactly what I need by doing something even through a manual process, so I can get enough information to ask good questions and to find a good tool. But if I'm PLOS One or Scientific Reports, and I have tens of thousands of articles flowing through the system and 10,000, 20,000 being published, then that's not really an option. So then I'm going to want to understand about what kind of volume goes through these systems and how reliable they are. And again, the pricing question's a different question, because, I have to build that into my razor thin, existence margin as it is. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, that seems to make sense to me, at least. So maybe Martin or Yvonne could say something in addition to that.
Well, as I tried to say in my introduction as well, the OA Switchboard is a not-for-profit industry-wide initiative that aims to serve everybody, and everybody's welcome to join. And if that happens, then we have the best possible service for everybody, and also the lowest prices. But added to that is that we aim with funders, institutions, and publishers to get to industry standards of how to communicate. And everybody knows that standards bring down a cost if you can stick to standards and not have to do everything in a custom way. And everybody who works with a Chronos Hub or a CCC or a Cypress or an OABLE or an editorial manager, the whole idea is right from the start for that with our open API, everybody can connect and benefit from this industry initiative. So there, I think Anne is absolutely right. And in our whole proposition and the way we price, by default, it should be cheaper than doing things yourself when it comes to this simple thing of connecting the many to many and communicating through an intermediary.
Okay, thanks.
And so also from a Chronos Hub perspective, acknowledging what Anne said in terms of primarily a lot of the smaller publishers that may not have the possibility to invest a lot in infrastructure that we've seen the biggest players do. Well, then we try to provide them with an out-of-the-box solution that is there with a complete end-to-end workflow, from the journal selection process and increasing the transparency of the institutional agreements that they may have, the whole way through to the actual payments and financial transactions, and providing these open access dashboards with approvals and access to all the data so that you can be Plan S compliant, seen to having machine readable access to license information and pricing information. And in that context, we take on sort of on our side to ensure that we connect with as many other initiatives as possible, and to automate as much of the processes as we can. So also when we work with institutions, we guarantee that we collect data and articles across all publishers, so they don't have to go into a lot of different places. So it is, I think from that perspective, we try to work very much as a full service, where some choose to only use bits and pieces, build it in under the hood on existing systems, and others go with a full, more long-term partnership in that sense.
Yeah, I guess it is what Anne says, that you have to maybe pick and choose what works for you, and then also be agile enough to adapt if necessary. So I'm looking in the chat and I see one comment from Paul Broom. He says, is OA like Open Maps? If it is like Open Maps, it will be a great success. Care is needed to manage and forecast costs. However, on, I think he means platform as a service and database as a service, can be unforeseen. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that. Paul, if you want to add something else, then let us know in the chat. Otherwise, we go back to Anne. I think she wants to say something more. And then I'm thinking that we maybe need to wrap up to go to the next session.
So I just have one question for both of you because I'm curious about it. So obviously, if let's just go into the future and OA Switchboard is usually successful and lots of things are plugged in and lots of data is going back and forth and Chronos Hub is taken off and again, volumes increased a whole bunch. So there's a lot of really, one of the things that's really a problem in our industry, quite frankly, is that we don't have a lot of good data, a good organization, a good industry-wide data. We always pull together what we can. We've had to live this at Delta thing, pulling together sources, trying to do surveys, pulling together as much as we can. I understand that there's privacy. I don't know who owns what as far as the data is concerned, but do you have any long-term plans as far as helping the industry to reflect back on the industry, just how they're working, like how things are going, using that data to help paint a picture of our environment, how transactions flow through, average costs, things of that nature, without, you know, naming names? Is that in the book, in the plans at all?
Yeah, I can take that question because we've just obviously had to finalize our service agreement for our early adopters and then launching customers. You can find them on our website, by the way. I don't have a list here, but in there, and absolutely two things that you mentioned are covered. One is indeed acknowledging the any other contracts that are in place. So if indeed publisher X has a contract with institution Y, and whatever they agree there in terms of privacy or who owns the data, that needs to be respected. And that is outside the scope of the OA Switchboard. So we've made it very clear that's in a way none of our business, but by signing up for the Switchboard and communicating through the Switchboard, you acknowledge that you need to stick to any other contracts that you have in place. And secondly, we have of course, I would be tempted to say, included in the service agreements that on an aggregated level, on an anonymized level, we can share information about number of transactions and things in the switchboard. So to that extent, yes, but that is way too early. We hardly have anything flowing through. But yeah, but you're absolutely right. There is this element of sensitivity. I understand your need, but we don't have that as an explicit goal to contribute to. But in this way, by these two clauses in the contract, that's how we've covered it so far.
Right. Yeah, and from a Chronos Hub perspective, again, we also ensure that every organization that uses Chronos Hub, they own their own data in the profile. Very often, if it's a funder institution, they are happy to share it. So, for example, all the data from on the Gates transactions are made public. We also share all of that with OpenAPC. As sort of an industry place to go, of course, for these kinds of data. And we have a collaboration with Crossref and DataSite, where we will, when we start issuing these grant DOIs, also deposit or update the Crossref records with article DOIs associated with the grant DOIs if the publishers don't do it. So we can do it on their behalf in that sense. And the data will also go into the PID graph, which is, I don't know, maybe not known by everyone, but one of the results out of the Tor, Odin, and Freya project from DataSite. And that's where data sets get linked up with the articles and the grants and so forth, which is a completely public resource of data, a big knowledge graph that anyone can then tap into and reuse data from.
Okay, thank you. So just briefly to close off, Paul has clarified his question. He asked about how easy it is to predict consumption and costs. So Anne, if you would like to give a last comment to that.
Me or Yvonne?
No, I was asking you, since I think maybe you can say something about the trends in OA, because I think, I guess he means that, yeah, for each company it would be different to predict how much OA articles there will come and how to take into account what it costs.
I mean, so generally, as far as usually what people use, which isn't necessarily always perfect by any means, but it's the best they have, is past performance as an indication of future. So for example, how much OA is in the discipline? Where is it being published now? How much are they getting that they're not publishing because someone requires an open access option? Or where do their rejects go? How many of them are published in open access? So you can do pretty well at predicting what might come in. Plus, you also take efforts to engage authors, to educate authors about open access in your specific discipline and to stimulate author submissions. And usually most people estimate that very conservatively. So by conservative, I mean low. They're going to say what they think they can get, and then they're going to take a percentage of that, maybe even as low as half of it. And then on the cost side, again, that's where these things come in, where, you know, sometimes for a cost on a very small journal, people might literally do this manually because it actually makes sense for them in a short time frame until they understand what they need and they start to see what their revenue is, and then they can model costs better. But modeling costs is usually, you know, it's basically, you take what you think you're going to get as far as articles, you take where you think you're going to fall with an average revenue per article, which is based on a whole bunch of things that are beyond the scope of this conversation. And then you start to look at what cost per article you can afford. And you start to look for things that fit within that budget and work from there. And hopefully your volume surprises you and you have more revenue to work with to absorb the cost.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I think we ran a bit late, but maybe it is still acceptable, Yadu. I think this is it from us. And thank you to all of my panelists, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you.
Bye, Freddie.
Very much.